Hello everyone, my name is Richard Gentry, President and Founder of RG Strategic Interventions LLC. I want to welcome you to this module, which is the second part of a two-part series on social learning. In the last module, we drew from Albert Bandura's works. He is considered the father of social learning. It is incredibly important to understand a lot of what he taught. And so I reference him on occasions when we talk social learning. In the last module, we talked about his Bobo doll experiment, which focused on observational learning. I would encourage you to go back to that module and familiarize yourself with that. But we also talked about the importance of models or role models when it comes to the influence that they have on the lives of those who are around them. So when we talk social learning, we understand that there is a continuous cycle of learning between individuals, oftentimes role models, but also their peers and the physical environment that's surrounding them. Today we're going to talk about many of our youth who grow up in the inner cities. Within our inner cities, there is a public health crisis because these cities and the influences surrounding these cities really is having an irreparable harm effect on our young people. So we're going to use the city of Detroit as Exhibit A, but we could focus on many other cities in the United States. For instance, Baltimore, Maryland, St. Louis, Missouri, Oakland, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Wilmington, Delaware, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we can go on and on and on. But before I get into that information, I want to share an analogy with you. For those of you that have a green thumb, you can appreciate this. Now, when I was a child growing up in the inner city of Detroit, my mother played such a major influence in my life. I was a mother's boy, and I followed her around, and I asked her lots of questions and learned a lot of things from her, of course. And she was a gardener, and she loved plants. And she had lots of plants in her home, and she had a garden in the backyard, and she spent most of her months during the spring and summer doing gardening, and I would be with her. I would observe her talking to plants, nurturing those plants, watering the plants, fertilizing them, moving them around to capture sunlight, and just doing a lot of things to nourish the plants. But what I observed is that she really worked on the environment. She never got angry with the plants. If there was an issue, she began to address issues in the environment. So how true that is when it comes to working with young people. Oftentimes, people see these people as defective. They see people living in the inner city as not capable of achieving, not capable of being productive citizens in society. But what I want to share with you is this. Maybe the issue is the environment and not necessarily the person. So we want to focus on that. Let's talk about cities. And for many, many years in the United States, especially when we talk about much of the minority community, it seems that we take a step forward and then two steps backwards. There's a term that you might be familiar with. Things change, but they remain the same. And I draw from the thought of those southern slave plantations and the conditions surrounding it, especially for those who were subjected to the harsh reality of slavery. And so when we talk about southern slave plantations, for most of us, it evokes certain emotions that are negative emotions. in this day and age, we think about the fact that how could people subject others to such conditions? This burden of free labor and living in harsh conditions. So when we think about that 160 years or so ago, those things come to mind. But I want to focus you on what's going on today in our cities. So when we think of today's inner cities, it can also be looked at as urban plantations. And oftentimes the conditions for those residents, those citizens, are not much better. So I made that comparison with the southern slave plantation and the urban plantations in our major inner cities. And my question for you is this: is there a difference? I think that we can connect the dots and draw certain analogies between the two. We can make these connections. In both conditions, these people lived in dilapidated housing, substandard housing. Broken families was a major issue of the day, yesterday, and also today. A high degree of violence. Our inner cities are very violent, just the same as those southern slave plantations with the lynchings and murders if things didn't go the way those slave owners wanted them to go. Little opportunity for decent education and advancement. We know that in these United States of America, that for the most part, education is the key to success. Years ago on those plantations, actually, when it came to education for African Americans, it was outlawed. It was discouraged by the slave owners. People had to educate themselves on a sly. They had to hide with their books and teaching their children if they knew how to read. It was something that was shunned on and despised by the southern white slave owners of that day. But when you think about the inner cities today, think about our failing schools. That thousands of our young people are trapped in these unfortunate conditions where these schools are not teaching them the things that they need. The dropout rates are through the roof. They're not achieving standardized test scores. Our inner city schools are filled with violence. And many of these students feel that the teachers just do not care. And I think it's safe to say that our public education system is pretty broken when it comes to the inner city. And because of all of these conditions, we find in both situations, southern slave plantations and living in the inner city, you'll find that atmosphere of hopelessness and despair. So I want to jump a little bit more into this because many of our detention centers and our residential facilities, child welfare organizations, as well as our public schools, are serving youth who come from the inner city and the ills that go along with inner city living. So I use Detroit as Exhibit A. I'm from Detroit. I love Detroit. I'm looking forward to investing in the city of Detroit. I'm most familiar with Detroit because that's where I'm from. And so I want to talk a little bit about some specifics, and I'm going to share some statistics with you. And keep in mind that these statistics that I'm sharing is not that different from other major cities in this country. So we do use Detroit as Exhibit A. There is a video that I show when I'm on the teaching and presentation circuit called Detroit Poverty Blues. This YouTube video depicts a young boy. He's about 12 years old and he's carrying a backpack. He may be going to school or coming from school. But as he walked through this neighborhood, he observes the dilapidated housing and the blight that's all around him. And he wondered, why won't the city tear down these vacant, burned down houses? And why won't they do anything about these vacant lots that's overgrown with brush? And so as he's observing his surroundings, it's almost just a normal thing to think that his environment has a major influence on his behavior and how he sees life. Back in 2013, the city of Detroit filed Chapter 9 bankruptcy. Detroit found itself with about $18 billion of unfunded liabilities. They were in massive debt, and they were not going to get out of this debt without the help from the federal government and a city manager that was assigned to the city of Detroit. Detroit was the largest municipality in this country to file bankruptcy. And so we know the ills of that situation. A lot of bad things happened. Many people moved away from Detroit. The auto industry was a major catalyst with the collapse of the Big Three to cause people to lose jobs and leave the city of Detroit. And Detroit was a city of about 1.6 million people at one time. And because of its steady decline, it found itself with about 600,000 plus residents. And so a lot of the city services, the municipal services, had to be cut. And the standard of living began to decline all the more. Detroit became a major news story that was featured in Time magazine, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and of course the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press. Lots of articles on Detroit because of this horrific situation. But as we go further, I want you to think about what an impact this bankruptcy, this decline had on the children of Detroit. The video that I referred to really highlights the fact that kids suffered greatly as a result of this bankruptcy. Now, I want to share some statistics with you, some very profound statistics to all the more bring home how impactful this unfortunate situation in Detroit was. During the bankruptcy in 2013, there were about 78,000 abandoned buildings in Detroit. About 31,000 abandoned homes and about 60,000 vacant lots. An astounding 47% of the residents in Detroit were listed as functionally illiterate. Less than half of the residents in Detroit over the age of 16 actually had jobs. And here's an astounding statistic that over 60% of the children that resided in Detroit lived in poverty. Think about that. Think about the impact that poverty can have on individuals in regards to their standard of living. The Detroit police force was decimated as a result of this bankruptcy. Even today, as I share with you in this module, Detroit's police force has been reduced by about 20%. During the time of bankruptcy, the size of the force had been cut by about 40%. When you call the Detroit police, on average, it took about 1 hour for them to respond to a crime. The national average in regards to police response time is about 11 minutes. So what a difference between the response time in Detroit and the national average. The violent crime rate in Detroit is 5 times higher than the national average. And here is something that really had an impact on me as I was studying the city of Detroit and the issues surrounding the bankruptcy. Less than 10% of the violent crimes committed in the city of Detroit were actually solved. That means that over 90% of crimes committed in Detroit happen without people being caught and paying a price for the crimes that they committed. Some additional unfortunate statistics that we may have heard when we talk about the worst cities to live in the United States. Detroit tends to find itself in the top 5, and in most cases is listed as number 1 in regards to the worst cities to live in the United States. 24/7 Wall Street, which is a website that focuses on financial news and government policy and the economy, depicts Detroit as the worst city to live in. How sad is that? The worst city to live in. So I cited these statistics for you to think about the conditions that these families have to contend with. And when you think about young people and the opportunities available to them in many of our urban areas, it's severely lacking. And if we don't have pro-social ventures for these kids and opportunities in regards to education and job skills and vocational training, we're going to run into these situations where we're going to see a spike in crime. The more prosperous cities are, the less crime there is. The less prosperous, the more crime. As police forces are reduced, the numbers, the crime rate is going to increase. When there's a solid police force and municipal services to serve its citizens, we find that our cities are safer. So many of the young people that we work with come from these conditions. Many of them have been under-socialized and mis-socialized. Many of them had to find ways of raising themselves without parents. Many of them had to survive on the streets. Many of them did not have a home to go to. Many of them lived in cars and trailers and from house to house, friends, neighbors. Many of them had to sell themselves, traffic themselves to make ends meet. And we can go on and on in regards to the unfortunate situations these young people find themselves into. But one thing we have learned about them is that they are survivors. And so when they come to our facilities, oftentimes they are broken. And so as opposed to seeing them as defective individuals, we need to see them as individuals who come from environments that have caused severe harm to them. And so our facilities need to be in a position where we can repair that harm through having healthy social learning environments. And so we will talk about healthy social learning environments in regards to facilities in future modules. We don't want these kids, here's another term that we tend to use, we don't want these kids jumping out of the skillet, which are bad social learning environments in their neighborhoods, and into the frying pan, which are bad social learning environments in a lot of our court order facilities around the country. So we're going to address that issue in a future module. So I'm going to leave you with that information. And I want to thank you so much for tuning in to this module. If you have the opportunity to log in through YouTube, I want to thank you and encourage you to hit the subscribe and the like button and leave your comments there. And that will be very helpful to me. If you had an opportunity to log in on my website, which is www.rgstrategicinterventions.com, I want to thank you so much for that. We'll have lots of modules there for you, so we would encourage you to check those out, and you'll have an opportunity to learn a lot of wonderful interventions when it comes to working with young people. And feel free to look at some of the presentations and some of the services that we have to offer through RG Strategic Interventions. So thank you so much, and we look forward to spending time with you in future modules.